Hello everyone! Today we'll discuss what the work of diplomats really is and how the world of diplomacy works. In our discussion, we will rely on a book, At Home with the Diplomats by Iver Neumann, political scientist and social anthropologist from Norway. So, let's start.
Settle, a British diplomat to whom the author refers in this book, argues that diplomacy is the maintenance of official relations between the governments of independent states. Let's analyze what Newman says about this, referring to his personal experience and the experience of other diplomats.
To understand how diplomacy works, you need to understand where it came from, and Iver Neumann introduced it with the ideas of the two diplomats. The first one, Nicholson, argues that the word diplomacy comes from Greece during the Italian Renaissance. Greece is considered to be the birthplace of the permanent diplomacy. Greek diplomacy is considered to be the basis of the modern European diplomacy. The second one, Neumann, emphasizes the existence of other diplomatic structures, such as Egyptian and Assyrian. He stresses that even before the appearance of European state and government, there existed other diplomatic structures that were quite as well as important. These contradictions between these two scholars is not uncommon, especially when it comes to understanding of the traditional diplomacy.
There are also some different difficulties which we can see when do analysis of diplomacy, and I will tell you some of them. And the first one, it is a privilege account, and it is traditionally studied that diplomacy presupposes the central position of Europe in development of diplomacy, but it is not true, and there are a lot of researchers who point that there are also different other ways to evolution and to develop of state diplomacy. The second is erasure. Traditionally, presentation exclude from the narrative everything that does not fit into it. Well, what does we mean when we talk about erasure? We mean understatement. For example, downplaying the role of the church in the state of the modern diplomacy.
When did diplomacy appear, particularly the diplomacy that still serves as an assistant to a state today? Diplomacy appeared only after countries began to be considered as independent units and gained their sovereignty. With the acquisition of sovereignty, there emerged a division into domestic and foreign policies. Foreign policy as a separate sphere of interest and influence requires the interaction of other parties, and it was then that the need arose for separate institutions of diplomacy with its own rules and order.
So now we have moved to another interesting part of our discussion. But what rules and how diplomacy works? Diplomacy has discourses and practices. Discourse is a set of socially recognized actions, as well as distinguishing when they're appropriate and how they should be performed. In a way, established set of rules. Practices, on the other hand, is how these rules should be followed. Execution of discourses in real life. And when these practices detour from the established set of rules, they create a precedent and gradually become a new discourse.
A huge part of diplomacy is a bureaucratic process. For instance, let's discuss writing speeches in the ministry. Speech writing is a very long process which involves dozens of people, an entire ministry at one speech. Thus, it is not just about delivering message, but the whole process itself is of high significance. While writing one speech, the whole ministry is involved. Each department has to make its contribution, and out of that collection of various thoughts and ideas, one cohesive speech has to be created. Hence, speech writing requires constant interactions inside the ministry, which in turn contributes to the socialization of the diplomats. In other words, speech writing is a part of identity formation of the ministry.
The key question which was discussed in this book it is what is it to be a diplomat? Diplomats have some key characteristics. One of them it is almost all diplomats have academic degree in social science, maybe in law or humanities. They know a lot of languages. They prefer live abroad. They are interested in public life, and the majority of them interested in politics, but not all. What about living abroad? To be diplomat abroad and to be diplomat at home, there are a huge division. And when diplomats abroad, they have a more free space, and when they come back home, they have a huge bureaucratic shock. Instead, what diplomats see as a key specialty are negotiation during which there is a representative of his country and a mediator. Mediation implies that the role of a diplomat is to be self-effacing. It is very interesting how diplomats identify themselves with the country which they present.
Next on the agenda is an issue connected with gender representation in diplomacy. For a long time, women weren't allowed to work in the office, but when they did start working, the only positions they could hold were typists. Another one was being diplomat's wife and hosting dinner parties. Female diplomat was still an oxymoron, hardly corresponded to reality. However, with time, the number of female diplomats and women in office other than typists grew larger, and certain trends and characteristics emerged. So author tries to analyze them. Neumann distinguishes three types of femininities in the context of diplomacy. The first one is diplomat first, woman next. For them, workplace hierarchy is more important than common gender affiliation. The second one is woman first, diplomat next. It emphasizes the role of the woman, but it can create certain problems. First of all, it can confirm male expectations and stereotypes about emotional, choosy, moody. Secondly, it can influence how non-diplomats and people outside the organization perceive female diplomats. And the third one is the new femininity. This femininity aims to combine the advantages of other two and cut the costs. So far, it comes across and increasingly dominant.
Neumann also divides male diplomats into three types of masculinity. The first are the civil servants. These are the men who come from upper class and aristocratic background. The second are petit bourgeois. These are the men from rural or working class background who are accepted in the diplomatic academy. They are petite because no matter how perfect of diplomats they are, there is still some rigidity and lack of something in substance. For them, there is always more to learn and more to lose. Lastly, the third type are the troublemaking, or author calls them intellectual type of masculinity. These are the men who brought disorder in the traditional hierarchy of masculinities. These are the men who first supported their female counterparts. Although so far civil servant masculinity still rules the roost, the gendered stories of new femininity and intellectual masculinity have brought disorder for decades into the traditional hierarchy of masculinities, and they have the potential to reconfigure them in the future.
Today we've learned that diplomacy and diplomats are not that simple and obvious as it may seem in the first glance. This profession is multifaceted, with its pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. And this book helps us to look deeper at the very essence of the profession, to look through the eyes of the diplomat at diplomats.